Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching our presentation today. My name is Ashley Huey, and today we will be giving you a presentation on ethnographic research. I'm from Greenville, South Carolina, and I teach elementary Bible.
And I am Stephanie Kimble from Rock Hill, South Carolina, and I teach the 4th grade at a classical school in Rock Hill. The first thing that we're going to talk about are the learning outcomes. After this presentation, you should be able to briefly state the definition and purpose of ethnographic research, describe the ethnographic research process, describe the key characteristics of ethnographic research, identify and describe the different types of ethnographic research, and lastly, describe the use of ethnographic research techniques. Ethnographic research is also called ethnography, and it consists of the study of the cultural patterns and perspectives of participants in their natural settings. Typically, a researcher will engage in long-term studies to get a much deeper understanding of the context in which a study sits. Ethnography has its origins in cultural anthropology and demands long periods of time in the actual research setting. The purpose of ethnographic research is to ask the question, what is going on in a particular setting? Ethnographic research is never done in a laboratory and is always done in the natural setting of the participants. It is very important to identify the purpose of any study before beginning research. The goal of ethnographic research and how it differs. The goal is to describe, analyze, and interpret the culture of a group over time in terms of the group's shared beliefs, behaviors, and language. Culture was defined as a set of attitudes, values, concepts, beliefs, and practices shared by members of a group. As a researcher using this type of method, you would want to keep culture in your mind at all times. In Walcott's writing, Ethnography, A Way of Seeing, he suggests the researcher thinks in terms of 3 broad conceptual areas that focus on tangible behaviors: cultural orientation, cultural know-how, and cultural beliefs. Cultural orientation is when the people or participants under study are situated in terms of physical space and activities. Cultural know-how is how a group goes about its daily activities. Cultural beliefs is asking why a group does what it does. There are some things we want to avoid when using ethnographic research, such as making general statements before the research is complete. An example would be to make a bold assertion about a culture before the study is complete. A researcher must be very careful to not make assertions until after the research is conducted. You also do not want to, not using the correct conceptual area to produce your research would be something to avoid. Ethnographic goals are much different than other types of research, such as goals of survey, correlation, causal comparative, and experimental studies, and that the methods we use dictates the kind of research we conduct. Remember, ethnographic is always concerned with the question, what is going on here in this particular culture and setting? This research method is also very time-consuming and might be difficult for some researchers to use since the time is so much lengthier. Ethnographic research is unique in that it is not trying to prove that a particular intervention solves a particular problem. In other words, ethnographic research is not aiming to implement problem-solving techniques to fix a particular problem. or what the researcher deems to be a problem. The aim is to merely observe a particular culture in its natural settings. We'll discuss now the steps in the process, just an overview, and then we'll go into more detail individually. So step 1 in the process is to identify the purpose of the research study. Step 2 is to determine the research site and the sample of the study. Step 3 is to secure permissions and negotiate entry to the research site. Step 4, you want to collect the data, including the use of participant observations, field notes, interviews, and you can examine any artifacts such as school policy documents and attendance records. Step 5, you want to analyze the data. Step 6, when you after this, you want to write an ethnographic account that is usually a narrative capturing the social, cultural, and economic themes that emerge from the study. The steps in the process will be broken down further in the next section, and we'll use an example to walk through for better understanding. So the example that we're going to use to walk through the research process is the same as the example in the book. The purpose of this study is to understand the social, cultural, and economic influences affecting the use of drugs at high school. So step 1, again, was to identify the purpose of the research study. So the first thing to mention is that in conducting ethnographic research, the researcher must first decide if the person has the time to conduct such a lengthy study. The researcher must also decide if he or she has access to the particular setting and participants desired to research. The researcher must look at their experience they have had in this type of research before deciding if they can handle such a task. And lastly, the researcher must decide if he or she has the commitment to undertake such a time-consuming study. The researcher for the example study has decided they have the time, they also have the resources to conduct the study, and is available to be fully committed to the study of high school. The researcher has also identified the problem and has a purpose for the study. Next, the researcher should demonstrate the relevance of the proposed study using a frame of reference that the reader will be able to relate to. Our example, remember, is of high school, and it is to understand the social, cultural, and economic influences affecting the use of drugs. To frame this particular study is easy given that there is a national epidemic of drug use, and the study can be seen in terms of a larger societal scale, not just inside the school. You would express the overall approach and rationale for the study as follows. The overall approach for this study of adolescent drug use in secondary schools will be ethnographic. The rationale for the study is based on society's need to understand how teachers cope with adolescent drug users in the classroom and the social, cultural, and economic influences affecting the widespread use of drugs at high school. Step 2 is to determine the research site and the sample of the study. Using our example about high school, we can walk through what issues might arise. If your role as the researcher in this ethnographic study, you would want to negotiate permission into the school setting. The researcher would also need to be aware of the potential ethical dilemmas he or she may face. For example, in this particular study, issues of confidentiality and anonymity would be crucial, especially if activity is observed that is illegal. You would also need to consider what types of behaviors are not allowed or permitted on school grounds. These are issues that the researcher must consider when doing ethnographic research. Step 3 is to secure permissions and negotiate entry into the research site. Once you have worked through step 2 and have considered the possible ethical dilemmas, the next step is to secure the permission and entry into the site. Our case study is at high school, and once confidentiality is discussed and a plan is in place, we can now move on to step 4. But this step includes building rapport with the participants. There are ways to secure names of potential participants. You could use law enforcement, school teachers, counselors, administrators. These individuals would be likely to help give names of adolescent drug users in the community. The best idea is to build a relationship with 1 or 2 participants, and once they have gained your trust, then explain the purpose of your study. You would want to ask them if they know any volunteers that would be willing to be observed. If they are students that are under legal age, you would have to secure permission from their parents first. Once you have secured entry into the research site and identified participants, you are ready to collect data in step 4. So step 4, you want to collect the data, including the use of participant observations, field notes, interviews, and any examination of artifacts. Artifacts would include school policy documents, attendance records, behavioral records, things of that nature. There are different ways to collect data, such as field study, notes, and interviews, and by examining artifacts like school policies, documents, and attendance records. Our example would likely use participant observations, field notes, interviews, and artifacts from the school's administration. As the researcher, you should refrain from asking any questions from the start. It is best to ease into the setting and observe the setting before asking your questions. Questions may come to mind, which is useful. You should just write them down and ask them later. Some questions that might be helpful in our case study at high school would be, how do you know the students in your class are using drugs? What are the school policies on drug use, drug possession, and intoxication in school? What types of social services are available to help students deal with drug-related problems? These type of questions are good, but they would probably be asked to teachers or administrators. Step 5, you want to analyze the data. Following the collection of data, the researcher will need to analyze and interpret the data and write an ethnographic account of the experience. The researcher would want to analyze their field notes and possibly interviews, as well as what notes they took in the setting while they observed. The goal in analyzing is to increase understanding of what is going on in high school. And then step 6, which is the last step, you would then write an ethnographic account, and this is typically a narrative capturing the social, cultural, and economic themes that emerge from the study. The final description will probably be a narrative account that captures the social, cultural, and economic themes. The narrative should include a description of the limitations of the study and any recommendations for what you would do differently next time. In the write-up, you would also want to include acknowledging that this narrative is not exhaustive, but it extends further beyond the researcher's involvement. So just to review the steps in the process. Step 1 was to identify the purpose of the research study. Step 2, you want to determine the research site and the sample of the study. Step 3, you want to secure permissions and negotiate entry to the research site. Step 4 is when you collect your data, including the use of participant observation, field notes, interviews, and any artifacts that you examine, such as school policy documents, attendance records. Step 5 is when you want to analyze your data. Step 6 is when you write an ethnographic account that is usually a narrative capturing the social, cultural, and economic themes that emerge from your study.
All right, next we're going to move on and look at some key characteristics of ethnographic research. The book provides a really long list of key characteristics, but they are all crucial, they are all important, so we're going to walk through them all and then give a little more explanation to each one. So the first one, Stephanie had already pointed this out too, is that ethnographic research always occurs in a natural setting, not in a laboratory. And this is because we're trying to observe participants in the setting that they are in and not put them in a lab per se. So always occurs within that natural setting. Usually in a classroom would be the natural setting there. Secondly, a key characteristic is that ethnographic research always involves close face-to-face interaction with those whom you are studying. This is more than just mere observation. It's a very involved type of research, so there is a lot of face-to-face interaction with your participants here. Thirdly, ethnographic research presents accurate reflection of participants' attitudes, perspectives, and behaviors. Because this type of research does happen in a natural setting, you do tend to get a very raw and accurate result. So it does show how these participants are acting, how they're behaving, and why they are acting the way that they're acting, because it is in such a natural setting. Next, ethnographic research uses inductive, interactive, and repetitious collection of data for the purpose of building local cultural theories. This goes back to the purpose of this type of research, the purpose being to understand certain cultures in a certain way, build those theories about those certain cultures. So like I said, it uses an inductive form of collection of data, interactive, that face-to-face interaction with your participants, and then repetitious. It's going to be very involved, a lot going on over and over again. Next key characteristic is that data is collected mainly through fieldwork experiences. Once again, just the idea, not in a lab when you're in the classroom doing your observations there, mainly collected through fieldwork experiences. Next, ethnographic research typically uses multiple methods for collecting data. We're going to talk about triangulation a little bit later, but that's the idea here of using interviews, observations, reviewing artifacts from the schools, those field notes, lots of different ways to collect your data, not just one singular way of doing it. So using multiple methods for collecting data. Next, ethnographic research frames all human behavior and belief within a socio-political and historical context. This type of research recognizes that the behavior of your participants is appearing within a certain social and historical context. It's not just happening in a vacuum. So you have to be aware of the historical context you're in, the socio-political context you're in. So for example, we are in 2016 now, so I have to understand what cultures are like within 2016, and say I'm observing an inner city school. That would be something I would need to take into consideration for the socio-political part of that. Next, ethnographic research uses culture as a lens to interpret results. The one doing the research must be aware of the cultural perceptions, not necessarily in a biased way, but to use it as a lens in knowing how to best interpret the results that they get from the study. It's just something to be aware of. Another key characteristic is that ethnographic research places emphasis on exploring the nature of a particular social phenomena rather than setting out to test hypotheses about them. So this is one of the biggest differences here about this kind of research. You're not setting out to prove or disprove a hypothesis per se, but rather you're reflecting on a certain type of scenario that's happening within that cultural setting. So as far as putting forth a hypothesis, you're really not going and expecting anything to happen per se, but more so just exploring the nature of a particular social phenomena. All right. Next is that ethnographic research explores small numbers of cases in great detail. You want to go deep and not necessarily broad. There are some that only focus on one particular case just so that they can get the detail from that. A smaller focus allows for more thorough observation here. So that's a key characteristic here. Next, we have the ethnographic research uses data analysis procedures that involve the explicit interpretation of the meanings and function of human actions. This goes beyond just noticing the behavior to actually interpreting what lies behind it. So you're not just making an observation of, oh, the students did this, but you're actually wanting to get to the root and interpret why those actions are occurring. Next is that ethnographic research requires researchers to be reflective about their own impact on the research site and cultural group. Obviously, behavior of the participants may change when the participants realize that someone is in there for the purpose of observing them. So this is definitely something that you as a researcher would want to be aware of, is that you're going to be mindful of the fact that their behavior may very well change if they realize that you're in there. You're going to make an impact just by them knowing that you were in there to observe them and to take notes about them. Next is that ethnographic research offers interpretations of actions by both observing the actions and why they are done. Once again, more than just merely observing what's going on, wanting to get to the root of why the participants are behaving the way they are, wanting to observe their attitudes as well as their actions and their intentions of doing why they do what they do. Next, ethnographic research offers representation of a person's life and behavior that is neither the researchers or, sorry, that should be nor, neither the researchers nor the persons. So when the researcher is giving a reflection about how that person is behaving and why they're behaving that way, it's not necessarily the researcher's perspective and it's not necessarily the person's perspective, but rather it's built on points of understanding and misunderstandings that occur between the two. So that relationship between the participant and the researcher is going to be super critical here. And finally, our last key characteristics is that ethnographic research cannot provide an exhaustive, absolute description of anything. I think this goes without saying that any of these studies cannot be exhaustive in their research. We have to understand that they take place in a certain time, in a certain context, not to mention from a particular perspective of the participants and the researcher. So, and Stephanie even pointed that out in your account, you're going to want to mention the fact that this is not exhaustive and that it does point forward to other research needing to be done in that particular area of study. So those are some key characteristics. From here, we're going to move on to look at 3 types of ethnographic research. These are the 3 most common types of accounts that you're going to write. Remember at the end, that final step is that you're going to write the ethnographic account that can be told from 3 different perspectives, and that's what we're going to look at here. The first one is what we call a critical ethnography. This one is highly politicized, and it's written to fight against inequalities or the domination or privilege of a particular group. So this one definitely is not objective. It is taking a certain side, taking a viewpoint in order to fight against those inequalities within a certain cultural group. So one example, I was looking in our library database and I came across an example of one of these. There was a study performed in Turkey back in March, actually, that found that working class students, as opposed to more privileged students, were more likely to show resistant behavior. And the author defined resistant behavior as refusing to be obedient students and rejecting the value that are given to them in the schools. And the author found that they do this due to the injustice that this class is often shown. So the author writes in order to advocate on behalf of these lower class students. This is definitely an example of a critical ethnography, writing from a certain perspective, highly politicized in order to defend a certain cultural group and advocate their cause. The second kind of ethnography is what we call a realist ethnography. This one is much more objective than the one that we just talked about. It's written using common categories like family life, work life, social networks. This one, like I said, is a lot more broad, a lot more objective. It doesn't really take a certain side, but is just kind of written to describe the things that the researcher found rather than to take a side and advocate for a particular cultural group. This one's probably going to be a lot more common, I would assume, in the way that it's written. And then finally, our third category is an ethnographic case study. It wants to describe the activities of a particular group and see how the behaviors within the group are similar, as well as how those behaviors develop over time. So like it says, with the idea of a case study, a lot of times this one is just going to focus on one particular group, being very specified, very thorough into looking into one particular cultural group. I did find an example of this one as well on the database. This was a study conducted back in 2012 in one public elementary magnet school to see how the science practices of teachers were influenced by the school's science curriculum design. So this one, like I said, specifically focused on that one school and its attitudes towards science. So that would make this one an ethnographic case study to see how those teachers were responding, how those teachers were teaching science based on the science curriculum of that one school. Ethnographic case study there. All right. From here, we're going to look at some of the research techniques that are implemented in ethnographic research. And the first one I referred to a little bit earlier is that triangulation of data. And this means using multiple methods, data collection strategies, and data sources to get a more complete picture of the topic under study. This also allows you to cross-check your information. When you get all your information just from one source, it's likely that it's not going to be reliable. So don't just rely on one interview or one time of observation, one time of observing a classroom. Rather, you want to use as many different methods and strategies as you can. This just ensures that you're getting the best results, ensures that you're getting the most accurate results when you can use multiple methods and strategies when collecting your data. So that is triangulation. Another research technique that is particularly helpful for ethnographic research is that participant observation. The researcher is not just on the outside looking in, but actually becomes immersed in the activities of his or her participants. So while you're doing this, you obviously won't be able to observe everything. You can't be everywhere at once, but the book actually recommends doing less because you can do it better. Make careful observations regarding where you happen to be at the time. Don't feel like you have to be everywhere at once, but rather, like I referred to earlier, go deep rather than broad. Make those specific observations about the places that you're at. And there are different types under this kind of technique of participant observation. There is active, privileged active, and passive. So a good example of an active participant observer would be someone who takes the role of a substitute teacher and finds how to adjust to the environment of the classroom as they are teaching. You cannot get any more active than being in the role of the teacher. So as you are teaching, you're working to adjust your methods, adjust your strategies depending on what that class needs. The book also points out that you must record your observations in this particular type. Record what you are finding and how you are adjusting to make things better for that classroom. So that's active. The privileged active participant observation would be perhaps working as a teacher's aide. So where you are still involved in the classroom, still very active in the classroom, but there are times when you can take a step back and watch and observe what's going on. So the aide would be helping the teachers at some point, but also have that time to kind of stand back and observe and take notes if he or she needs to. And finally, there is the passive observer. This one has no responsibilities in the classroom, but simply focuses on recording the observable data. So they're still involved in the classroom in the sense that they're hearing what the teacher is teaching, but they have no real responsibility in the classroom themselves and are simply responsible for taking notes and observing. So that is participant observation. Another really key research technique in ethnographic research is that of field notes. So these are compiled on site during the study. These need to capture your experience with detail so that you can write that narrative account later. You want to get as much down as you can in these field notes. Actually, the book goes as far as to call this your primary tool in this type of research, because this is what you look back to when you go to write that ethnographic account. You look back to these notes and draw upon them to write your narrative. So for some tips for writing field notes, because it can be a little bit difficult to get down all that information, some tips that I came across is, first of all, compile your notes as soon as possible after your observation. You don't want to go forgetting what you just saw that day. So if you can do them during your time of observation or even just right after, compile them as soon as possible so that you don't forget the details. Secondly, you're going to want to use keywords and phrases to jot things down. Now, you're not wanting to write an eloquent paragraph here per se, so just writing down those keywords and key phrases that you hear to kind of jog your memory and help you remember what you did see, that's what you want to do. Just kind of that journalistic technique of just writing down everything you can. Shorthand is awesome for field notes, so just use those keywords and phrases to kind of jog your memory as to what you saw. And then finally, if you're looking for a way to organize your notes and having trouble, it's always best to organize notes in chronological order. Start with the beginning of the day, what happened, then go to what's next, and work your way on to the end of the day. Organizing them in chronological order is never a bad idea. Two last things regarding research techniques. The first one being you're going to want to observe and record everything you can. That just goes along with the field notes. As you're doing the field notes, you're going to want to take those good notes, but you can't write everything down. So if the school allows it, doing video recordings, audio recordings, taking photos, any way that you can record the information that you see is going to be good. Obviously, obtaining school's permission first. Recording verbatim conversations is another way to get a lot of information recorded down for you to use. And then finally, your last research technique is you're going to want to look for bumps and paradoxes. So don't go in expecting to find something in particular. This goes back to not trying to prove or disprove a hypothesis. Go in with a very open mind and look for those bumps or something that sticks out of the norm in the classroom, and look for paradoxes, things that are contradictory in this setting. Your observation will be a lot more effective when you go in with an open mind and you don't go in looking for something in particular. So just go in and see what sticks out, and that's the stuff that you want to take note of. Let's go over some potential challenges for ethnographic research, and all of these that were listed are actually key characteristics of ethnographic research as well, but these are things that can be pretty hard to accomplish. The first one would be developing and maintaining an intimate face-to-face interaction. Because this kind of research is so reliant upon building connections with participants, this is a crucial step, but it can be hard, especially if you're not trying to force those kind of interactions and you want to let it happen more organically. That can be really difficult, but yet it's something that needs to be maintained. Secondly, another potential challenge is sustaining lengthy fieldwork for a full cycle of the phenomenon of this study. So like Stephanie mentioned earlier, this is a very time-consuming type of study, so you're going to want to make sure that you don't cut the research short. You want to be truly able to observe what goes on in that environment, but many times that can demand a lot of time in order for you to get the full story. So are you going to be able to give the time that this kind of research requires? Finally, another potential challenge is using the concept of culture as an interpretive lens. This does make interpreting your results a little easier, but doing this in an objective and unbiased way can be very difficult. So finally, in summary, I want to just summarize what we've talked about today by asking the key questions of what, who, how, and why. So just in summary, what is ethnographic research? It's the study of cultural patterns and perspectives of participants in their natural setting. That's so key there. Who is involved in ethnographic research? The participants of a particular cultural setting is who we're looking for there. How is ethnographic research conducted? It's that 6-step process. Remember, identifying the purpose first, determining the site and sample second, securing permission and negotiating entry third, collecting data fourth, analyzing data fifth, and then finally writing that ethnographic account sixth. And how would also be implementing the techniques of triangulation, remember using as many methods as possible, participant observation, and the use of field notes. And then finally, why do ethnographic research? For the purpose of describing and interpreting behaviors within a specific cultural setting. What is going on here in this setting is the question that you are seeking out to answer. So thank you everybody so much for listening to our presentation today. This is actually the second time we've done it, and so hopefully maybe it was better this time. But thanks for joining in with us. We wish you the best as you guys finish up this course.
Thank you so much. Good luck for the rest of the semester.